Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our first Red River webinar series, 2021 Guide for Modernizing, Mobilizing, and Securing the New Workforce. This webinar is brought to you by Microsoft Teams. During this webinar, we do have a Q&A section on the top right. If you have questions come up, feel free to ask them there. Today we have Jason Waldrop, Red River's President of Managed Services, providing this webinar. So with that, Jason, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks everyone for joining. I hope everyone's doing all right here in COVID times, and we're getting used to these Teams events here. Look forward to seeing many of you live and in person when we get to the other side of this thing. So we're going to talk about this whole notion of the remote workforce, and really kind of we're going to spend a little bit of time talking just about the permanency aspects. We were given a similar presentation, throughout the early sort of part of the pandemic, because our clients we were hearing it everywhere. Hey, our VPN's getting overrun, or this, that, the other thing. How do we go about enabling this remote workforce for the pandemic? But what we've learned is, there are aspects of this thing that are here to stay in a good way. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about kind of maybe how do we build our IT service delivery model and our overall IT stack to sort of address some of these elements. So we'll start just about kind of enabling the remote workforce through some of the digital transformation strategies that we have. And we kind of break it into three buckets: securing the access to the environment or applications itself, securing the devices that we use to access the environment, and then finally securing the data itself. Okay, and so we'll talk through those three kind of core pillars, and then we'll close out with a piece on collaboration with Microsoft Teams is the primary focus there, because as we work remotely, the ability to work in a collaborative manner creates a lot of efficiency, and Teams has really been the productivity tool of choice really throughout the pandemic. So we'll go through that in a bit of detail too. So here we go. All right. So when we, as I mentioned, we used to, early in the days of the early pandemic, we were talking about, oh man, everybody's going home and working from home, and for a little while here. But now what we're seeing, as evidenced by some of these news clippings, this is not a short-term phenomenon for a few months while we're dealing with a global pandemic. This is like changed the way companies are thinking about their workforce permanently. So we think about our ability. We've learned that we can work in this remote environment. Many industries can, at least. Obviously, I don't want to trivialize how devastating this pandemic has been to certain industries and families and livelihoods and all of that. We all know that there are aspects of the economy that have been absolutely destroyed over the last 9 or 10 months. But in the professional services, tech services, and all that kind of stuff, those sectors have kept kind of chugging along, and largely because of this ability for everyone to be productive and work collaboratively from remote. So businesses have learned things like, hey, we can hire folks. We can think about broadening maybe the geographic markets that we used to be bound by when we would attract talent. We're at Red River, we're hiring people all in places that I never thought we'd be hunting for talent. But turns out there's some really talented engineers that, for lifestyle reasons, want to live in pretty remote parts of the country, and so they value that, and we're able to get to them and find really productive talent here at Red River. And then there's even just, we have a lot of people that work in the DC area, and anybody who works in DC or any of the major metros, New York, LA, Chicago, Austin, the traffic and commute is brutal in those places. And so what we're seeing is we're getting an even more productive workforce because of the 3 or 4 hours a day people are having to spend commuting. They no longer do. They're more refreshed. They're maybe working a little bit more. So anyhow, there is a permanent element to some of this. And so what that means is, for those of you who've been hanging around Red River managed services, we've been messaging. It's no longer sort of that old school, here's your company issued laptop with hardened applications, and this is your productivity machine. Right now, it's every user is bringing multiple devices to work. Their fifth graders configuring their Office 365 account for them on their iPhone, and so that's just the world we live in. So we have to make sure that we as IT enable that, okay? Because in many ways, it's great that our users have the luxury of being productive at their kids' soccer game, right? And so they can enjoy that family time and be in touch with their business. But we have to make sure that experience is secure as that user is looking at maybe a sensitive contract or something like that on their iPhone at that soccer game. We want to make sure that we're good stewards of how that data is handled. Okay, so I mentioned earlier we think about this through three primary optics. One is securing the access to the environment. So we'll talk a little bit about the access and connectivity itself, MFA, risk-based conditional access, these types of things. And then we'll also do a little discussion on virtual desktops. We've seen a significant uptick in virtual desktops during the pandemic, and some of that is because of just raw need. Because in my mind, virtual desktops for years have been a dirty word. Okay, but some of the reason for the uptick is some of this stuff actually works these days because of the cloud. So the ability that maybe we're finally able to deliver upon the promise that for virtual desktops that we've been talking about for a long time. All right, so that's one, securing access. Two, securing the devices. This is really around mobile device management, mobile application management, managing the PCs and Macs and stuff that are used to connect to these environments and making sure they're secure and patched, and we understand the context within which they're operating and make decisions accordingly. And then finally, securing the data itself. Now, this is a fairly evolved approach. We think about things like Azure Information Protection, configuring ATP and DLP policies, but there's some stuff that's a little bit less sophisticated that we can get at right away, and that's backup and DR. I mean, the number one prevention for malware, honestly, is having good backups and disaster recovery, right? So that's even easier these days with the cloud. Okay, so let's start with securing access. Okay, so when we think about connectivity today and a user coming in to an environment through the cloud, it's no longer, like we said earlier, here's that hardened laptop that the company IT department gave me. Here's my VPN authentication, and I know that I'm now securely accessing that let's say my CRM system behind the firewall. It doesn't work like that anymore. Users are on multiple devices in multiple contexts. What does that mean? It means I could be on my laptop the company gave me in the office behind the corporate firewall doing work activities, accessing that CRM application. That's a pretty secure context, okay? But different, I could be on my iPhone behind an IP anonymizer in some foreign country trying to access the finance system, okay? Different context. And so we need to make decisions on those differently. So we call this inspected session risk. And if you kind of follow this chart left to right, you'll see like, all right, the user, like I know that it's Gary that's trying to log in, because regardless of what device he's on, because Gary has given us his username and password, and he's authenticated with multi-factor authentication. So we have a high degree of confidence that that's Gary, okay? But now we need to look at this session itself and the context of that session and decide how risky is this session for Gary. So we could say, well, like I said earlier, Gary's on his laptop, I'm on the corporate firewall trying to access a low impact application, fine. Or we could say, look, we saw Gary log in Seattle 2 hours ago, now suddenly he's logging in Miami. That's an impossible travel situation. His account's been compromised, shut it down. And there's a whole bunch of different actions you can take based on many different scenarios. So this screen here is really just illustrative of like what we talk about when we say risk-based conditional access, which is really kind of the most evolved way we look at inspected session risk. And that's, here comes the user. They give us some left to right here. Here comes the user on any one of these devices. They want to access some application all the way over to the right, okay? Well, now the user gives us their multi-factor authentication credits. Now we know it's them. Now we can start to look at some conditions. Location, where are they? Where were they 2 hours ago? Where are they now? The state of the device, is it an Android device that's been jailbroken? Okay, or an iOS device that's been jailbroken? And maybe we don't like that and don't want to let that in. What user group is this user in? Is it an executive who has access to very sensitive information, or is it a temp who has only a little bit of access to things that could not really be that harmful to the company if they got out? And then finally, there's this last thing that's unique to Microsoft's solution, which is their risk scoring system. So Microsoft has their collective intelligence center where they're looking constantly at, like, hey, do we see this user's username and creds out in the dark web? You know, all kinds of ways of like understanding through Microsoft's internet intelligence universe there, how risky does this session look to that set of analytics and that AI and ML engine, and then they'll score it. So when we put all four of those things together, we can get a pretty good sense for the risk associated with this session and the context of the session. And then we can take some actions. Hey, let it fly. It's good to go. Maybe we need to ask for MFA one more time just to make sure that it is Gary. Or maybe we think this device has been compromised. And we're just going to block access and wipe that device. A whole host of things we can do based on the information that we acquire in the milliseconds surrounding an access request. Okay, so kind of final component here is the virtual desktop piece. So we all know, I mean, like everybody probably, we've all had, anybody who's been hanging around IT for a while has had a failed virtual desktop experience before, okay? But that doesn't mean that the use cases aren't there and haven't been there for a long time. There's always been a strong use case for this technology. It's just been a matter of the viability of the technology itself. So whether you look at highly regulated environments, financial services, healthcare, government, flexible workforce like we have today. Okay, so one of the big forcing functions we saw here with virtual desktop was, so we have a customer that's got, let's call it 5,000 users or 500 users. It doesn't matter how many users, but their firewalls were sized to be able to terminate VPN connections on a typical work from home day. So maybe 40% of their users, we size VPN connectivity for that. Well, when we suddenly overnight go from 40 users to 400 users using VPN or whatever the right ratio for your organization is, the firewalls got overrun. Okay, and the thing with VPN termination is it's not always as simple as just adding more licenses. VPN tunnel termination is CPU intensive. So a lot of times what it meant, especially in the early days of the pandemic, was I have to get new hardware, okay? Because the hardware I have, even if I license it up, can't terminate the amount of VPN connections that I'm seeing demanded by my end users. Well, in the early days of the pandemic, hardware lead times were like unknowable, really. So the only solution was virtual desktop, and so it really forced a lot of this stuff to go into place. And now what we're seeing is customers like it, and they're leaving it in there. So whether it's that flex remote workforce, like we know, specialized workloads, which we've always heard about, maybe think like bank tellers or docs in the patient care environment, running an EMR app or something like that. These are all been good use cases for WVD. So what we've done at Red River is kind of leverage what we've learned over the years about virtual desktops, taken on what Microsoft has built in their Windows Virtual Desktop framework, which runs in Azure. And the reason why we like this, I'll get into a bunch of it, but it starts with, it's a really solid user experience built to work with Office 365 natively. Most of our customers are already licensed for it, so you're only paying for CPU and compute, which we manage very efficiently through our, we have a software overlay that we use to do things like to elastically load balance and shrink and grow the CPU and memory requirements and server farm and all that to make sure we're maximizing the efficiency of the environment from both a performance and a cost perspective. Okay. I mentioned that this stuff actually works. It's really has to do with the architecture that that you get in the Azure Virtual Desktop, the Windows Virtual Desktop experience, right? So they bought FSLogic, so this gives containerized user profile, which is like roaming profiles that actually work. Okay, you get really fast logon times. Okay, it's built to work with Teams. You can run Teams meetings out of it, Teams video meetings out of it, just like this, and it runs lickety split. Works on Mac and other OS, indistinguishable, right? And then from a like, well, I guess I mentioned Teams performance. The thing I think is really kind of cool is printers. So when we were first testing this, I told our team, put me on one of these things and I'm testing printing right away. So one of the neat things is if you're running Windows 10 on your host machine, on like I do on my laptop, I spun the virtual desktop up. The virtual desktop can see into my home laptop, for example, as long as it's running Windows 10, find the printers that are mapped to it, and I can print to those straight away through the Windows Virtual Desktop without having to do any configuration. So it solves that printing issue that's been one of the real pain points with VDI over the years. Okay. It's also highly secure. I'm not going to get into a ton of this, but you get all the Azure AD security stuff. You get a reverse proxy, so no reason to open any inbound ports. Okay, and all the sessions are isolated. You have multi-level roles-based RBAC, right, for admins and things like that. And then lastly, we have a whole managed service component to this, which, like I said, we'll manage the desktop pools. If they're, to the extent there's a need for dedicated machines, we'll do that too. Okay, we'll help keep all the images current and re-provisioned. We do all the auto scaling logic and host sizing to make sure that you're getting the most efficient use of the environment as well, cost-effective use as well as performance management. And then obviously we're there for tech support, whether it's, hey, this isn't working, or doing all the typical administrative and operations and maintenance stuff, pool repair, backup, restores, etc. Okay, so that's the securing access component. Now we'll talk about the devices. So first thing we think about here is securing the device itself, what we've historically referred to as mobile device management. When we talk about mobile devices, we think of mobile devices as Windows 10 desktops, Macs, iOS, Android, you name it. Anything that's coming at us these days is a mobile device. So we'll do things like take a look at the hardware. Does the hardware meet our spec from a OS versioning and patch management perspective? Has it been jailbroken? Do we need to do things like turn off the camera or mic? There's a lot of things we can do to just validate that this hardware itself meets the security requirements that we have for connecting to our environment. Okay. Then we want to go ahead and roll out the application management piece of this. So this is one of the biggest things we see when we walk into a customer's environment who's maybe struggling with getting this rolled out themselves. It is pretty dangerous to just allow your users to go into the App Store and download whatever version of OneDrive they want to, put it on their phone themselves, and go and use it. And that stuff is happening all day, every day. The reason why that's dangerous is because it's not being governed by IT. It's the user went and downloaded. If they've got their Office 365 creds, if the tenant hasn't been properly configured, I can download my OneDrive thing, set it to sync to my phone, and then copy stuff to my Dropbox or whatever like that. Okay, so we want to make sure that we are controlling as IT what version of these apps go out, and that we have the ability to wipe them at an application level, manage the data, do things like make sure, so here's a good example I use a lot. So I have an 11-year-old son who's a baseball player, and he and I travel around during the summer playing baseball up and down the East Coast, and I've got an iPad and he likes to play Fortnite, and so I'll hand him that iPad and he plays Fortnite on it, but on that same iPad is my Teams, my OneDrive, my Outlook, SharePoint, all that stuff. I don't want him getting in there, so our IT has configured it to where if I want to go into OneDrive, I got to give it my thumbprint or some form of multi-factor to open it up. So I can easily hand him that iPad and know that my work stuff's going to be undisturbed. Okay. We can do things like make sure we can put what are called copy paste restrictions in. So if we don't want people to be able to take a document from OneDrive and put it in Dropbox, we can enforce that, for example, through this framework. So lots of flexibility here with the mobile application management framework, and happy to in a post call go into detail there. All right, so we talked about securing access, securing devices. The last piece is securing data, and for us, this is fairly evolved, like in our digital transformation aspects of this are, I should say, fairly evolved in the digital transformation journey that we walk our customers down. Most of the time, some of this gets implemented early, like ATP and email, but some of this stuff might take a client 2 or 3 years into the digital transformation journey to really adopt, because it requires the business to think about things a little bit differently. Okay, so let's just go through a handful of big topics. ATP. Okay, so we know that most of the malware malware is the largest threat it's the preeminent threat to business, small and large. Okay, from a cyber perspective. So, and most of malware comes in through email, people clicking on an attachment or a link that they shouldn't click. Okay, so in Office 365, we can relatively straightforward to implement ATP and safe links, and safe attachments, which means here comes, obviously you get all the anti-phishing and anti-malware stuff inbound on email. But then let's say the email actually does make it through those scrapes and gets to the end user. Well, now we can, through safe links and safe attachments, the user can click on those and that document will go over in a sandbox and get unpacked and then inspected before it gets to the user. So that way, if Microsoft detects that there's a problem up there, it kills the document up there, notifies the admin, and no harm, no foul. Okay. So a lot of stuff we can do in email that just is really, really easy to kind of implement, that provides a huge level of protection for the environment from an email perspective. All right. Then as we start to get a little bit more involved, we start to think about DLP, and we like this again because most of you out there are probably already licensed for this in your Office 365 tenant, and whereas in the past this would be fairly expensive third-party software for us to come configure, and then it's expensive to maintain and all of that. So when you think about why do you need to think about DLP these days? The cloud has made this, and especially in this remote work environment, DLP, like, you're no longer just going to your end drive, okay? From when you show up to work, open your computer and go to your end drive. No, you're getting your data across a lot of contexts. So how do we make sure that our users are sharing externally things that we think they should be sharing externally? If we're, like, one of the big topics these days is CMMC, okay? And the evolved version of NIST 800-171. So we have a lot of clients that are marking their documents as CUI, and then like making different policies available, based on that. So really, the way that we do this is kind of discover everything we've got out there, classify it, label it, and then we can just, if a user's trying to do something, we can warn them, we can block it, we can send it a note to the admin, a lot of things we can do, okay? So in the kind of at the highest level, we think about looking at all of our data through discovery. And then in addition to looking at our existing data, we also look at what happens when new data gets created. We can put default roles in by user, by group, by SharePoint site collection, by team, you name it, okay? Bottom line is get this stuff classified and labeled. So classified might mean, let's call it CUI, or let's call it HIPAA. Okay, we're gonna see this as HIPAA, we'll label it as HIPAA, and then we can, those labels can do two things for us then. We can put a retention guideline on there, in the case of HIPAA, 7 years. So hey, this stuff's gonna get archived for at least 7 years. And then we can also say things like, hey, if this thing has PHI in it, we're not gonna email it outside the organization without it being encrypted. Like, we can just make that happen automatically so a user doesn't have to think about it, okay? And the examples are sort of endless. I think you get the point, and we can always go deeper on this in a later discussion, but bottom line is classify, label, and then monitor and take action based on how the data is moving in and out of the organization. Okay, I'll go here. All right, so now we talk about business continuity. All right, so in the past we would think about, well, we still do think about business data protection, backup, DR, kind of in this umbrella data protection and backup and disaster recovery strategy, right? So backup, we know what backups are. I've got a copy of my files or whatever somewhere else, and I have X amount of copies, whatever. Sometimes compliance drives the archiving strategy. Sometimes the business does. Bottom line is I've got maybe dailies, weeklies, monthlies, yearlies of backups. That's good. Need that. Everybody needs that. Then you have high availability. Okay, so what's high availability? High availability, really, VMware and virtualization brought us the notion of high availability, where we can have a cluster of physical servers built such that we can withstand the loss of one or two of those servers, and our environment will continue to run, allow IT to replace those servers, put that CPU and capacity back into production, and it just adds more to the environment. But meanwhile, the business never missed a beat. A physical server failure, a physical switch failure, a shelf, a disk could go down, and we don't interrupt operations. Okay. Then we have disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is really this idea of, whereas high availability is kind of like making sure our production data center, our primary site, is available to withstand, there's no single point of failure, for example. When we think about disaster recovery is saying, like, now there's no site that's a single point of failure. We have a production site and a DR site, maybe is how people think about it. So I've got a primary data center in Ashburn and a secondary data center in Atlanta. And the Ashburn data center replicates to Atlanta such that if we have a terrible event, an airplane strike or a fire or something in Ashburn, we can fire up Atlanta and put our users back online. Okay, so that's really, we're going to talk mostly about that disaster recovery piece, because that's been, most of our customers have backups. Most of our customers have disaster or have backup, have high availability through virtualization. But what many folks have not been able to pull off over the years is DR, and that's every bit as important now in the cloud world as it's ever been. And the cloud sort of enables us to do DR differently and makes it a lot more approachable for many workloads and many companies. So what have been the issues with DR in the past? One is cost, okay? You got to have twice as much stuff, right? So if you want to have 150 workloads running in production, you want the ability to have those same 150 workloads running in DR, you got to have enough server compute, storage, network, and everything else, and a secondary data center somewhere else to spin that up in the event of a disaster. Just how it is. You might be willing to make take some performance decreases, and so maybe invest in a little bit slower hardware, less memory, less CPU, but still you need a second stack. Okay, it's complex to manage. It's a separate set of data centers. You got the replication software. You probably want to do test DR activations. This is all pretty complicated. And then you overlay most of the time, a lot of our clients, the DR stuff is driven by some sort of compliance framework. So now, okay, my SOC 2 type 2 in this data center, how do I validate all that? Well, it's doable. We've been doing it for clients for years, but the cloud has made it orders of magnitude less complex, okay? So when we think about reducing the cost, well, with what's called Azure Site Recovery, which is what we're talking about here, you don't need to purchase a secondary data center. You just pay to replicate the stuff up there, and then you only pay for the servers when you turn them on and use them. So that might be when you're doing a DR test bubble or a real activation. But the point is, you're paying, like, what is it, 25 bucks a month per workload for the replication service, and then you only pay for the compute and memory when you turn it on. So it is a small fraction of what historically would cost to spin up a second site for DR. It's a lot less complex as well, because you're not worrying about all the stuff you have to worry about in the second data center. Oh man, we just lost a fan in one of the core switches. What do we do now? Or any of those, that stuff goes away in the cloud, as everyone knows, right? So just by definition, it's a less complex environment, and it's a heck of a lot faster to get spun up. And then you get to benefit from all of the inheritance compliance features that you get when you move to the cloud, whether it's Azure or AWS, right? You benefit from inheriting all of the foundational compliance stuff that are delivered by those folks. So a whole host of reasons why this is better than the way it used to be. And this is what it looks like very simply. This is just a silly little animation that shows a web workload running on PHP with MySQL underneath it in VMware. Okay, so what we do when we implement ASR is we replicate those workloads up to Azure, same workloads, now living in Azure. And when if something really bad happens, that user is just redirected, and we can do this through DNS, a lot of different ways of dealing with this, to point them back to Azure. And then of course you can always replicate back when your VMware environment comes back online. So just a simple little illustration of how this works. Okay. Final stretch here. We're going to talk about tying this all together with collaboration and productivity software. Microsoft Teams really is what we're talking about here. So there is, I mean, I am sure this part of the presentation might be rote for many of you because you've been living on Teams for the last 6 months, but you know, there's no question Teams adoption is just through the roof. So for those of you who don't really know what Teams is kind of the center of the modern workplace experience for Microsoft. It's where you, like in my world, I have Outlook and I have Teams, and that pretty much is it. I don't remember with OneDrive, I guess, is the other thing. So I get my files through Teams, I do my chatting through Teams, my calling through Teams, my meetings through Teams. You know, everything is kind of there. All right, so kind of one place you got to go. And we think of Teams performing 3 functions: collaboration, meeting, and calling. So I'm gonna kind of talk about each one of these briefly. So from a collab perspective, okay, we think about the chat functionality, which is, everyone knows kind of chat. This is not new. So we can have group chats, individual chats, persistent chats, all that. And then we have Teams. So Teams is like, so think of Teams as like a way of kind of replacing what might be old distribution groups in the organization. And then those just, maybe you had like an accounts payable distribution group, and then accounts payable folder somewhere on the network that people in accounts payable could find. Well, now you can have an accounts payable team and different channels in that team, and each one of those can have its own file structure, its own persistent chat thread, its own set of, you can launch meetings in there. You can have a OneNote persistent in there. So it's a much easier and more logical way to work. It's a heck of a lot more efficient, and it reduces email. In my personal case, when we got fully rolled out to Teams, I saw my internal email traffic go down by about 50%. So it's a great way. It creates a lot of space in your life, and it's wonderful in many ways that way. From a meetings perspective, we're on a Teams live event. Most of you have probably been on a Teams meeting. That very high quality video. And these days it's pretty dense too. Okay, there's a lot of feature functionality in here from a sharing perspective. Obviously, you can launch it through Outlook. Your calendar is brought into the native Teams client. It works on any device, anywhere, iOS, Android. It's really simple to use, and like I said, very high quality video experience. The Teams Mint, now some of you who only started using Teams during the pandemic might not be have had a ton of experience with what we can do from a Teams meeting room perspective. When you go back to work and you want to be in a conference room and join a meeting, Microsoft has hardware devices. There's a whole host of vendors. Poly, formerly Polycom. Poly builds a lot of these things. So center of table devices that can drive Microsoft Teams meetings from a conference room perspective. And the neat part about these systems, one of the challenges we've always had is, okay, this side of the house is a WebEx shop. These are Teams folks. That's Zoom folks over there. Each one of those requires a different room system. Well, now with Microsoft Teams rooms, we can join any of these. We can join a WebEx, a Zoom, or a Microsoft Teams meeting from the same center of table console. Huge game changer here. Really looking forward to getting back to work and starting to do a lot of work like this for our clients. And then if you haven't used the Microsoft Surface Hub and some of these other Microsoft products, you should get your hands on one. The Surface Hub is a really good device. The whiteboarding works excellent, native integration with Teams and everything like that. So it's a really slick device. And then finally, calling. So you can enable Microsoft Teams to become your corporate PBX. So it'll do auto attendant, voicemail, all the typical PBX functionality, and you can have PSTN plumb into it, either from Red River or from Microsoft. You can buy calling plans. You can run your own SIP trunks into it, and it's your phone system. So you can have a hard phone on your desk. You can use a soft phone, just regular speaker, whatever. So we are seeing a fair bit of folks that have been on legacy on-prem telephony environments start to use this as their overall corporate phone system and down what their legacy environment was. All right, so in closing, the one thing I want to call out here is if you've been a Red River customer or a CWPS customer prior to that, now Red River customer, you've seen this digital transformation journey 1,000 times. So I just want to point out that like much of what we covered here today was discussed as a result of the pandemic and the permanency aspects of it and all that, but like really this is all stuff that sort of we've been guiding our clients down this road pre-pandemic as part of the overall digital transformation journey. So one of the things that we enjoyed hearing when as the pandemic happened was I got lots of emails from some of our clients that had already gone down these journeys with us and said, man, I'm so glad we did this because we were able to send everybody home and everything just worked. So that was great to hear, and that one, it means we've been executing, but two, it means strategically we're positioning our clients for things that we know are right technologically, but they help prepare for the unforeseen events like we've dealt with the last couple of years, or last several months, I should say. Last piece here, so Microsoft has this thing called the Fast Track program. It's basically money for you, the client, to offset adoption and migration services into these new technologies. Red River is one of the more productive Fast Track partners for Microsoft. For perspective, we're one of 6 public sector authorized Red River or Microsoft Fast Track partners, but we have a lot of Fast Track expertise commercially and across the board. So if you're thinking about doing something like this, let us know, and we might be able to find you some money to help support these initiatives, because Microsoft has several incentive programs for clients where they basically pay Red River to help get some of this stuff going for you. So Gary, that's the last slide. I'll kind of turn it back over to you for a second.